Mark woke up to the soft chirping of birds outside his window. The sun had yet to rise fully, but a faint light peeked through the curtains. Despite the ache in his body from weeks of labor, Mark felt a strange sense of anticipation. Today, he had nothing planned, no jobs to rush off to, no looming deadlines. For the first time in months, there was space to breathe. He sat up slowly, stretching his arms above his head, and listened to the muffled sounds of his siblings stirring in the next room. Their laughter was faint but comforting, a reminder of what all his hard work had been for. He could hear Dani's voice excitedly recounting something to Mia, and her giggles filled the small house. It brought a smile to Mark's face. As he made his way to the kitchen, he found his mother already up. She was seated at the table with a steaming cup of coffee in her hands, staring out the window with a thoughtful expression. The morning light highlighted the lines on her face, evidence of the many sleepless nights she'd endured. "Morning, Ma," Mark said softly, grabbing a glass of water. She turned to him, her face breaking into a warm smile. "Morning, sweetheart. Did you sleep okay?" Mark nodded, taking a sip of water before sitting across from her. "Yeah, I did. Feels weird not having to rush out the door today." His mother chuckled, though it was tinged with fatigue. "You've earned the rest, Mark. You've been working so hard. I'm proud of you." He smiled, though there was a flicker of unease in his chest. "Thanks, Ma. I just hope I can find something more stable soon. We need to make sure we stay ahead." She reached across the table, placing a hand on his. "We will, Mark. We've made it this far, and I have no doubt we'll keep going. You've done so much already." Mark nodded, her words reassuring him. Still, the weight of responsibility lingered. He wanted to believe that things would keep improving, but a part of him worried about the unpredictable future. After breakfast, Mark decided to take a walk. The morning air was crisp, and the streets were quieter than usual. As he passed the familiar cracked pavement and worn houses, he noticed how the neighborhood seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for something to happen. Mark's mind wandered back to his time working for James and the lingering whispers of suspicion that followed him. Even though he had stepped away from that job, he knew the neighbors' opinions wouldn't change overnight. He turned a corner and found himself near the park. A small patch of green nestled between rows of rundown buildings. Children played on the swings, their laughter carrying through the air, while a group of elderly men sat on a bench, deep in conversation. Mark hesitated before sitting on a vacant bench nearby, watching the scene unfold. As he sat there, lost in thought, he heard a familiar voice call out to him. "Mark, hey there, kid." He looked up to see Mr. Howard approaching, a smile on his face. The old man's steps were slow but steady, and his cane tapped lightly against the ground with each movement. "Mr. Howard," Mark greeted, standing up. "Good to see you." "Likewise, son. I was just on my morning stroll and spotted you sitting here," Mr. Howard said, settling onto the bench beside Mark. "How've you been?" Mark shrugged, leaning back against the bench. "Been all right, I guess. Just trying to figure out what's next." Mr. Howard nodded, his expression thoughtful. "That's good. Taking the time to think things through. Not everyone does that. You know." Mark glanced at him, unsure how to respond. The old man seemed to sense his hesitation and continued. "You know, Mark, I've lived in this neighborhood a long time, seen a lot of folks come and go, and let me tell you, it's not easy being someone who stands out." "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his brow furrowing. Mr. Howard leaned on his cane, looking out at the park. "People here, they're used to things being a certain way. When someone tries to change their own story, it makes folks uncomfortable. They'll whisper, doubt, even try to drag you back down. But that doesn't mean you're wrong for wanting something better." Mark was silent for a moment, the old man's words sinking in. "It just feels like no matter what I do, people always think the worst of me." Mr. Howard turned to him, his gaze steady. "That's because they're scared, Mark. Scared of what they don't understand. But you've got something they don't, a reason to keep going. Your family. Don't let their fear become your burden." Mark nodded, a small smile tugging at his lips. "Thanks, Mr. Howard. I needed to hear that." The old man patted Mark's shoulder, his grip firm. Anytime. Son, you're doing just fine. That evening, Mark sat at the kitchen table with his mom, going over their finances. The envelope James had given him had been a huge help, but Mark knew it wouldn't last forever. They needed a plan to stay afloat in the long term. What about that community center down the road? His mom suggested. I heard they're looking for part-time help. Mark considered it, tapping his pen against the table. Yeah, I could check it out. It'd be nice to work somewhere close to home. His mom smiled, her eyes filled with hope. I think that's a great idea. They do a lot for the neighborhood. It'd be good to be part of something like that. Mark nodded, making a mental note to visit the center the next day. He wanted to find something stable, something that wouldn't bring the same kind of scrutiny his work with James had. As he looked at his mom's tired but hopeful expression, he felt a renewed determination to keep moving forward. The next morning, Mark walked to the community center. The building was modest but well-maintained, with bright murals painted on the walls and a small garden out front. Inside, the atmosphere was warm and welcoming, filled with the sounds of children's laughter and the hum of activity. Mark approached the front desk, where a woman with curly hair and kind eyes greeted him. Hi there. How can I help you? Hi, Mark said, his voice steady. I heard you might be looking for part-time help. I was wondering if I could apply? The woman's smile widened. We are. Actually, do you have any experience working with kids or doing maintenance work? A bit, Mark replied. I've done maintenance work before, and I've helped out with my younger siblings a lot. That's great, she said, pulling out a clipboard with an application form. Why don't you fill this out, and we'll set up a time for an interview? Mark nodded, taking the clipboard and sitting down at a nearby table. As he filled out the form, he couldn't help but feel a glimmer of hope. This felt like a step in the right direction, a chance to start fresh and build something meaningful. Over the next few weeks, Mark found himself settling into a new routine. He got the job at the community center, where he worked part-time doing a mix of maintenance tasks and helping out with the kids' programs. The work was fulfilling in a way he hadn't expected. Seeing the kids' faces light up when he fixed something or helped them with a project made the long hours worth it. His family also began to find a new sense of stability. The neighbors still whispered occasionally, but Mark found it easier to ignore them. He focused on his work, his family, and the small but significant progress they were making together. One evening, as Mark sat on the porch with his mom, watching the sunset, she turned to him and said, You know, Mark, I think we're finally going to be okay. Mark looked at her, the weight that had been pressing on him for so long lifting just a little. Yeah, Ma, I think we are. And for the first time in what felt like forever, he truly believed it.